Today I'm speaking with Anthony. Anthony, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me. And Anthony and I are just getting acquainted just today. So we're new friends. Anthony and I are in a group where we were able to share some thoughts about deconversion. And Anthony and I touched base. And we just appreciate Anthony's willingness to come on and share his story. I want to give a brief background. Again, I don't know too much about Anthony, but I'll tell you what I know. And then we'll ask him for his more details on that. Anthony has a background in media production, working with well-known brands and celebrities to capture live events, as well as working in television, film, radio, and more. Some of his projects are available through Amazon Prime, Netflix, and Hulu. That's pretty amazing, very impressive. He was a Christian for 8 years, and in his words, he found himself at a crossroads about 2 years ago. The crossroads was summed up as this: would he continue to be what the church wanted him to be or demanded him to be, or would he take a stand for himself against manipulation, false teaching, mesmerism, and abuse to become a human being again? Anthony is a spiritual egalitarian, which I'd like to hear what that means. And he advocates for people making this shift away from harmful, toxic religion through involvement in online communities and finding helpful resources for those in transition. So before you elaborate on any of that and fill us in on more of your background, I had a quick icebreaker. What are some of your favorite hobbies and skills?
I love playing guitar. I don't play it as often as I should, probably, but I like playing guitar a lot. I've dabbled in digital painting, and that's been something I've been like, do I pick it up again? Do I not? So I think within the last couple of years with that, especially, I put together at least 3 different portraits of people using photo references and stuff. And they came out pretty good, but it's one of those things. Yeah, thank you. It's one of those things you have to kind of continually practice. So, I've been moving around a lot, so it's kind of been collecting dust, but maybe that. I like to read and just find out new things and see how things work. That's kind of how my mind works. And that's partly why I came to where I am now in sort of the faith area.
Yeah. Could I ask with the guitar, how long have you played the guitar?
Well, I've been playing since 14, so 22 years, I guess.
Gotcha. And what's your favorite genre of songs to play?
I like really aggressive metal, like death metal, things that are, see, there's so many different subgenres, but like I don't need it to be super technical, but enough to where my dexterity is challenged, and speed and sort of stuff is always constantly improving in terms of like picking speed, notes, and all that stuff. So, Cannibal Corpse and bands like that. I just really love that style of music.
I've not heard of them. I'll have to look them up.
Yeah, start slow. If you're not used to the style of music or the kind of imagery or band names or song titles or lyrics, then it can be a shock. But I can send you some links and sort of start you down that way if you want to check out some things in passing.
Yeah, I'd be curious. And for the painting, are you using like a stylus just on the screen? Okay.
Yeah, just Photoshop and a little, I don't know, I would say like 5x7 tablet and a little pen.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting because it's kind of like using Zoom, where you think that if you look at the person in your screen, you're looking at the person, but there is the tendency you have to sort of remap your mind to follow where the cursor is, as opposed to looking at your pen, because my particular tablet doesn't have a screen on it, so it's sort of like hand-eye coordination, a new way of looking at your hand-eye coordination.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any other hobbies or skills you wanted to?
Oh, I don't know. I've been studying digital marketing for the last couple of months, so I have a handful of certificates, certifications, and I'm moving my way into. I'm attempting to get a job in that area over the next several months. I think with honing my skills, I'm working with a company in the United States just for free. I was like, hey, I use your products, I like them, and I'm learning about how to do this. I'd really love to be able to put it into action so that when I do translate into a role, I have a case study behind me, at least. So I reached out to a handful of brands that I use, and one wrote me back immediately, and he was like, yeah, let's do it. So I've been doing that for the last couple of months as well. So I told him I'd do it for for 6 months, we'll see where we're at. And then, hopefully we have made an impact in your business large enough to warrant, continuing on from there, or at least getting a reference or something. So it's been pretty cool.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome. I'm in this spot where a lot of my hobbies are kind of put to the side temporarily just because life is just busy. We've got 4 little children and the job and the videos. So it's a busy life, but one of the hobbies I miss is I used to be a cabinet maker.
Oh,
and
cool.
there is something about just using your hands and like, you created this and you can now see it on the table. And I miss that a lot. We've all moved to such a digital world where it's all on the computer.
Yeah.
That there's something just about, even just physically walking in the grass or whatever, like it's nice to get reconnected to the world. So it's cool, especially with your, playing the guitar.
Yeah, it's certainly a tactile experience. And that's one of the things I think a lot of people are certainly missing now is not only a sense of community, like a connectedness with the environment or your neighbors or just people in general, but also I think a lot of people miss the benefits of, like you said, like walking out in the grass, maybe even barefoot, or sitting in water, like putting your feet in water and just kind of looking around. Like, this is pretty cool, because everything is just this sort of myopic, like, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do now?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. The barrage of emails and messages that come in to respond to. The computer is very addicting in a often negative sense. So could you tell us, going back to your story, could you tell us a little bit more just about yourself in general? Not necessarily your spiritual story yet, but just, tell us who is Anthony?
I'm still learning that. After this,
good start.
Yeah, I mean, after this rigmarole with, I hate to sound disparaging. I'm not trying to disparage anybody's faith at all, or even that I had one, or even if I have one. That's like, these are things that are very new now. Yeah. Like, once I kind of came over that hump in a way, or some of it, enough to where it's like, okay, so who am I really? And that's part of the reason why I had to drop everything, because I became an entirely different person, and not in a positive sense. Like, I became so disconnected from myself as a human being that I'm now in a place where it's like, I spent 90 days working on a self-discovery journal earlier this year, like answering these questions and really thinking about, what these things are asking me and how they apply to my life. Because it's not so much about, discovering different things about yourself or new things or adding things to yourself, but like, how will they apply to life? And how can you create or foster a life where those beliefs, those character traits or desires or values guide you, as opposed to, you'll have to forgive that. I took my dad's dog out this morning and she's hanging out, but she's a little snorty, so you may need to, cut here and there. But so that's the bigger thing for me, is like, not so much who I am, because I honestly, at this point, I know some of what I am, but after taking such a long involuntary hiatus from a personal inventory, you lose sense of the things that you should admire, or that other people do admire about you, because I can say, oh, I'm funny, I'm kind, I'm really like, I'm very loving person, but I'm sort of learning how to project that better and keep myself protected from, unwanted advances or, negative atmospheres, whatever the case is. But, like, I'm funny, I'm kind, I have a really great sense of humor, very dry and witty, but also goofy at times. And I love to cook. I'm not terribly great at it. Like, I don't think I'm super amazing, but some of the things that I make are pretty cool. So that's enough for me. And I like to cook for people and stuff like that. So I don't know.
Where did you grow up?
Where did I grow up? I was born in Pennsylvania, but then we moved to California early on. I'd say between 8 and 9. I guess I was between 8 and 9 years old.
Okay. Do you remember what part of Pennsylvania you were in?
Yeah, we moved around a little bit in Pennsylvania. I was born in Bradford, which is the home of the Zippo lighter. And then we moved around outside of like Harrisburg and stuff before we came out this way. So we were close to the capital.
Okay. Yeah, I went to Lancaster Bible College, which isn't too far
Oh,
from you.
cool. Okay, great.
Very cool.
I'm keep in mind, I haven't really spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania since I was a kid, but
Right, right.
I know generally what you're talking about. So that's really cool.
Yeah. And were your parents believers?
No, my mom didn't become a Christian until I was about 14. And I'm not sure what prompted
Okay.
her. I guess just trying to handle my dad. My dad, for the most part, has been and is like sort of open-minded spiritually, but he's there's also some like an underlying bent of like not only dissatisfaction, but like a real like core anger that I was thinking about this morning actually while I was with the dog. I was like, I think it probably comes from a lack of personal protection because he kind of grew up in an unstable home and then tried to cope with that using means that never really work. And so we got a lot of that with my sisters and me. And
That's really
so,
sad.
yeah, so I mean, it just kind of carried the chain. But based on the stories that my mom has told me, like at a point, he was trying to, find churches for us and stuff like this. But there was something that just eventually it either just gradually went away or there was like a hard stop to it. Because growing up, I never knew my dad to be spiritual in any sense. He never really talked about it. He never professed anything. He never did much with that. But they were both raised Catholic until their confirmations, then they left.
Okay.
So I don't know if that has any bearing on anything.
Could I ask just in general, would you say that there were any significant spiritual influences on you, whether it was other family members or friends, or do you feel like you grew up in a pretty, for lack of a better term, a secular or atheist agnostic background?
That's really hard to say because like it just really wasn't a part of anything. Like it just really wasn't a part of anything that we did. It wasn't like a label or a particular stance. It was just there was that facet of life just was not there. It just and that's not because it's bad or wrong or we didn't find the right church. It was just wasn't there. And
Did you all have any like snippets of religion, like say at Christmas time, where you'd maybe sing a few Christmas carols,
no, not
or
really.
like you go to someone's home for Thanksgiving and they'd say let's say grace
Oh yeah,
before we
well
eat?
yeah. I mean,
Anything
we always prayed at dinner and stuff, said grace
okay.
and things, but we never really caroled. And this is the strangeness about where my dad is in terms of his spirituality is like he loves Christmas music. He loves like the sort of choral choir kind of Christmas music. He doesn't. He's not a Christian by any sense. Not that you have to be to enjoy it, but I find that an odd departure from sort of this rigid kind of like I don't want to talk about it sort of thing.
Yeah,
But
that's great though. I mean, there is some beautiful music. It's hard for me to enjoy it the same way, of course,
yeah,
since deconversion, but it is, it's definitely, there's some beautiful stuff, and I honestly miss some of that beauty. I'm aware of how dangerous it is to try to incorporate that back into your life.
yeah.
But just there's some beautiful music and just the emotions of it all, especially when you had it as a kid.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so can you tell me
Mhm.
where did religion start to come into the picture for you?
Well, I don't know if this is a typical thing, but it seems certainly possible. I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but when my mom was baptized, she was very staunch in her. It was almost like a militant fundamentalism, but just like out of nowhere. So,
What
and
kind
I
of
don't know if
denomination was that?
hell, I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know.
When you say militant fundamental, I'm immediately thinking Baptist just because of my background, but I'm sure there's some other groups that would
I
take
really
that.
don't. I don't see. And again, I don't really know the difference between denominations. A lot of them, so I couldn't tell you, but I don't think so.
Sure.
I don't really even want to name the church in case I just don't want to do that. But
Sure.
as far as I'm aware, it was just like a mainline contemporary Christian kind of thing. But suddenly I became the target of her crusade because I was into horror movies and beginning to open up sexually as you develop in in adolescence and stuff like that. She was not having any of it. She tore up a script of mine that I was reading of a movie that was yet to be produced, and she tore down this poster of this girl I had in a bikini just sitting there. I'm just like, I was at school, came home, and it's all ripped up. Like, okay, well, thank you for not appreciating or respecting anything of mine. It's like, yeah, granted, I'm living in your house, but that should not give you carte blanche license to just barge into my room and take my stuff and throw it away. That really damaged me quite a bit, looking back on that. And that was it. I mean, I went to the baptism that she had, and then I didn't want anything to do with the religion at all. I didn't really it wasn't even, I wasn't compelled. I didn't see a need, but it wasn't like it was not like trying to keep this thing at arm's length. It was just like, what do I need with this? But to oblige, she would invite me to church. I'd go with her, and my sisters would go. And I think they got involved into youth groups and stuff. I really wasn't. I was studying film in my room and playing guitar and stuff. But yeah, I remember going to like a communion service, where they would have communion in it. And I was just like, I can't do this. This is cannibalism. That's gross. Like, I don't appreciate the symbolism of it, and yet the irony, because, being Christian for any number of years, I'm sure at some point you're likely to take a communion of some kind. And sure enough, over the course of my Christian life, that was something I would do fairly regularly. And, I'm not well versed in the blood magic symbolism of it all to really say like, oh, this is a dangerous thing. I know some of it comes from, I forget, started with an O, but it was early in the morning. You have to forgive me. As if not a mythological conqueror, an actual conqueror who's, I think who was captured at some point, and his soldiers, his main people, divided up his body and drank his blood and all this stuff. So it kind of the lineage of the sort of Christian symbolism kind of comes from that, whether people want to admit it or not. So yeah, I wasn't really interested, and I went through my teenage years kind of I think I was more keeping an arm's length away from being harmed by anything that was going on than sort of like actively avoiding involving myself in it. It was like the ways that the religion presented itself to me early on even were damaging. And granted, the home environment with everything we grew up with was not conducive for a happy environment. So I kind of, blocked off myself from that more than it was being closed-minded or closed off from the religion itself. But yeah, I mean, I didn't become a Christian until I was like 26 or 27 or something like that. And
could I ask, when you say that, was it your mom that was part of that discussion, or just the church?
No. I mean, looking back, I always had Christians around me in one way or another. And the first job that I had in media production, my boss, who's still a friend of mine, was a Christian, and he seemed like really genuinely interested in being my friend. And he introduced me to his circle of people, and they were living in intentional communities, and they all seemed so like, it was very different from what I grew up with, obviously, but sort of different from sort of traditional roommate kind of dynamic. I was really intrigued by that. But I don't know. I mean, my reasons for becoming a Christian are kind of lame. Like I was investigating it, and he and I had done a little bit of a Bible study, but like to the point where we'd go over some stuff. But if I had some questions, he's like, "Oh, read these books or figure it out on your own." I'm like, well, that's not really the best way to introduce somebody to your way of being, or your faith, for lack of a better phrase. But I guess it was a combination of my investigation, and then there were some sort of smear campaigns or something like that going on against Christians in the media. And I was kind of like, typically if news media tells you not to look at something or not to pay attention to something, there's usually something behind the scenes that you need to see. So there's usually a kernel of truth. And then I was falling asleep fairly regularly to the Case for Christ documentary on YouTube. And I don't know, it took about a week once that started happening. And I had some interesting spiritual experiences that were sort of leading me in that direction. which was interesting, but I'm not going to go into that right now. And then eventually I was just like, God, if you're real, I want a better life, because I was going through some stuff. And this huge just sense of peace and calm came over me. And it was like, well, I kind of have to take care of this thing and that thing. So if you can put a little bit of that panic back into me, that'd be kind of nice. But that was really about it. I tried to find a church in LA, but it was the ones that I went to, the ones that I could find were borderline TED Talks, and I didn't really find them to be of any substance. It was more about the show than anything of any worth, really, frankly. And then eventually I moved to Texas, and then that's when the ball started kind of rolling in terms of how I ended up into like this weird Pentecostal. I don't even know if it's fundamentalism. I don't even know. But I was just like, I don't know what to make of this. And everybody says that I have to do this. And if I don't do it, then, all this other stuff. So I just kind of got roped into it.
I want to dive into that pretty deeply, because I think it's something that both would be interesting, as well as just, I'm not as aware, like my background was not Pentecostalism.
Sure.
There was a little bit of charismatic flavor to some people that were in my circles, but it definitely was not to the extreme of Pentecostalism. But just one quick clarification before we do that.
Yeah.
When you say you became a Christian, just for one of the things I've seen a lot levied against atheists is the issue of, well, you were never a Christian for real in the first place, so you didn't really deconvert because you weren't really, you weren't really one of us.
Yeah.
So you didn't really leave us. You were just kind of a visitor, and your exit isn't really an exit. Can you tell us, what did it mean to you to be a Christian, and or what is the gospel? What is the gospel of Jesus?
Well, that part of it's a little bit of a loaded question, more than
sure. Answer it however you feel best.
Yeah. Man, that's hard, because like I could take a broader approach, or try to think about what it meant to me then, but what it means to me now is completely different. And frankly,
what did it mean to you then is definitely what I was aiming at.
I don't know. I mean, at the time, I guess I felt like I found the right path, like after I've always struggled with existential problems, and lots of it has to do with how I grew up. I understand that. But I also have a hugely inquiring mind that's hardly ever satisfied, unless I'm like, okay, that's how it is. And then I'll move, it's like, I'm very project oriented with my work. And that's why I've been fairly successful freelance wise, up until the transition sort of that I'm making. Because I'd lock into a project and be like, okay, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this, and that's the result. And you see the result, you move on to another thing. But when I became a Christian, especially once I felt that sense of calm, I was like, okay, so where do I go from here? And then once I started telling people, once I started telling my friend that I mentioned, and then other people that I sort of met over the course of my being in LA about this, it felt like I belonged to a club, or like the right group or something. I don't know how to explain that. It's very weird too, because like, it felt like there were all these different resources for Christians available now. It was like, oh, now you have all these things available to you. I'm like, okay, well, that's cool. So yeah, I guess I kind of felt, at least for a little while, like I was on the right track, to use a terrible phrase. But thinking about it now, it didn't really solve anything for me. It didn't quell any of the problems that I have internally. Like, it didn't make me feel like, because I never really cared about heaven or hell. I still don't. I was more concerned about being the best person I could be. And in doing that, you have to confront the things that are holding you back, or that make you miserable, or that make you question or wonder. And it never really seemed to answer those things for me. The longer I went through it, the longer I was involved in it, because I went to Bible studies, I went to groups. I tried to avoid the, like men's groups and stuff, but, like singles Bible study and, home studies and small groups and church services and stuff like this. And I'm just like, I never really got into the worship, especially in the Pentecostal thing where everybody's like up in arms and shouting and yelling and clapping. I'm just like, it's music.
Well, could I ask, was it presented to you, or did you understand it clearly in a way where, for example, you were presented with, and there's different ways people do this, but basically like in a really succinct sense, a bad news, good news kind of sense of saying,
Yeah,
you
I kind of
are
did.
a sinner, you need Jesus, he's a substitute, your trust in his death and resurrection is what covers you.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for sort of bringing me back to that. I understand it sort of went off track a little bit there. So my apologies. But yeah, it very much was like that. It didn't feel like a welcome home. It felt like you're a bad person. And in order to alleviate this badness, which then over time was like, oh, you'll never be able to get rid of this because everybody is sinful and you're a sinner no matter what. And then it's like, so what's the point? What, sinners saved by grace. So thanks. Like,
well, to them, to Christians, that would be it's a life of gratitude for Jesus's rescuing you from your sin and pending punishment.
But it didn't, like, I even saw that it didn't even do anything. Like, it didn't do anything to alleviate that. If nothing else, it probably wiped the slate clean for your personal relationship or whatever with the Father. I could see that. I'm like, okay, cool, great. But it doesn't. Okay, I shouldn't. I'm using generalizations, and I'm going to try to avoid that. But like, I typically saw that it didn't do anything to change human behavior, without adding a certain onus to, oh, I got to do the right thing, or I should treat people better because I'm not deserving of forgiveness, and yet God forgave me. You know what I mean? Those kinds of things. So it's like extending extraordinary grace for no other reason than having this kind of like thing on your shoulder, like, oh, you got to be a good person. So I didn't really see that it did much in the way of changing human behavior for the positive, naturally, like organically. There is always kind of like guilt mechanism built into it. Or the threat of punishment. Yeah. The threat of punishment. It's like, oh, well, and then, then you have these people, it's like, oh, well, once you're saved, you're fine. No, you have to do good works. Nobody can figure it out. So I was just like, okay. So it put me in this place where it's like, okay, so I cannot bring up these objections or these sticking points that I'm having in my own personal understanding of how this should work for me, but also theologically. And very few people were willing to oblige my questions, almost to the point where it would have potentially cost people too much to answer them, like objectively. And I felt out of place. The longer I went on in a church environment, and then eventually I left, I kind of want to stop this answer just to make sure that I have answered what you asked of me. It was, yes, it was shown to me through kindness. And then once you get in through the door, it's like, oh, you're a bad person. And God, I was told, God doesn't see you. God sees Jesus in you. God doesn't love who you are. God loves you because you accepted Jesus. I'm like, well, what does that do for a human being? Like, that didn't solve anything for somebody who's been told, like, oh, God is love and God loves you unconditionally. It's like, no, there's very clearly a conditional situation.
Yeah. And what I would just clarify is Christians could and would and will and do add a lot of clarifications to that and say, well, no, you were in a church that didn't quite represent it correctly, or no, there's a different way to see it. Kind of like just, when you go even back to the bare basics of the blood of Christ, it's like you could describe it as blood magic, and I would too. And they would say, oh, no, that's not what's going on. That's not blood magic. But once you step back from it, you're like, actually, yeah, this was about blood magic. That's exactly what it was. And what you're saying, people would add caveats to, well, no, Jesus really does love you, but it's more that, like you said, it's God seeing Jesus through you. They would try to add all these caveats and clean it up. But at the end of the day, when you step out of it, it's pretty weird. And I would add to that, to what you said, that it's a unconditional love that's completely conditional, which is, it's bizarre, but it's like, I love you unconditionally now through Christ, but if you ever turn your back on me, you will burn in hell. And if you turn your back on me, not in terms of not believing anymore as an atheist, but you just don't live for me, then you will basically ruin your life. Like, you must, it's like a tree in the vine. You must be, stay grafted, to stay connected to the tree into which you were grafted, for the life to flow through you. And yeah, if you don't agree with exactly what this book says and live it, your life is basically meaningless. And it's like I will bless you if you do this. I'll curse you if you step away from it.
Yeah. No, and and it's funny too, because like I didn't see that until I left. You know what I mean? Because I didn't leave because of theological problems necessarily. I mean, I saw through enough of what was going through the pulpit and doing my own actual Bible study without a book telling me how to do it, or without somebody else or a group or whatever. Like, I was sitting here and like, look, these are the topics that these people are talking about that are really affecting me, and I need to see what the Bible says about it. And a lot of it had to do with, again, I don't know denominations and what their preferences are, predilections and stuff like this. But it just, when I got into this sort of Pentecostal environment, it really felt like it was an amalgam of a bunch of different agendas. So you have people who are desperately trying to hear from God, or promoting the belief that you can, speaking in tongues, not that you can't. I don't know. I'm still on the fence about whether that's actually a thing or whatever. I don't care to go into it right now. But you have people who are speaking in tongues, people who are desperately looking for prophecy, and a denomination that's very much about finding, or going to people who have this sort of insight. And then, just a heavy emphasis on the signs and wonders. I remember being in church one time, and this little girl up on the pulpit talking about, I don't know, God wants to heal you or something. That's always what it is. It's like, oh, come to church, God wants to heal you. And he never does.
Did you say a little girl was saying that?
Yeah, not a little girl, but
young girl.
Yeah.
I know this isn't your main point, but that just, it strikes me so harshly of abuse. Like just a young, I mean, if you're 18 to 21 and you've kind of made your way in life and you're old enough to think through it, fine. But that's, at that point, that's your choice. You're an adult. But man, to have a young girl doing that, and I've seen some of the videos where even young kids are kind of groomed to be preachers, and it's almost kind of funny. Look at that little 7-year-old preacher, screaming the Bible at the people, and it's like people are laughing because he looks just like his daddy or whatever. But it's like that's a version of a psychological child abuse.
Absolutely, it's terrible. And that notwithstanding, I mean, this particular instance, I was just like, you guys are. I was sitting in the pews or seats, whatever, and the longer I went to this church, the more removed I was from the stage, and to the point where I was just way in the back in the dark. And I was just like, I'm here. I'll go through it because I think I have to. But anyway, I'm sitting here. I'm like, you guys make an awful big deal about signs, wonders, and miracles, and yet you really kind of gloss over cultivating a relationship with this figure of yours that you claim to love. It's like you constantly want him to show himself and do this thing and heal that person and all this stuff. But like, and then you'll come back at people who don't understand how to put this together in their life. Be like, oh, well, you just need to pray more. You need to read the Bible more, or that it's somehow some innate knowing of how to communicate with this entity, spirit, whatever.
Yeah. And
I found that fascinating. I was like, boy, you guys are just love to run the show, all the lights and the rah and the excitement and stuff like this. But when it comes down to, finding that place with you and God, it's up to the individual attendee. And I find that really odd. It's like, so what do you need me for? Why am I here?
Yeah. Did you find when you were in the church that you're talking about, two questions. Number one, did you ever see anything when you mentioned the word miracles and signs and wonders? Did you find anything happening that you observed where, and not from a true skeptic's perspective, and not like you could stand there with a camera and say, I'm checking you, but just from where you're sitting in the pew, did it look miraculous? Like someone said, hey, I had cancer. Here's the, a month ago I had cancer. Here's the documents that said I had it and I was needing treatment. They prayed over me, 5 times and I just got this. And look, the doctor says I'm completely cancer free. Something that looked like, wow, that's pretty cool. Like if it was true, that's
Right.
amazing. Did you see anything that struck you? And then secondly, kind of related, with the music, the worship music and so forth. Did you ever feel this sense of like just the way that they would play the music would kind of give you a tingly feeling? It would like, and you think, is that the spirit?
No,
No.
never. No. And that's not to say that that doesn't happen, but the reason I say no is because I don't know if I mentioned this in any of our correspondence prior to this sit down, but I worked for a fairly prominent prophetic figure in her ministry. So like I was behind the scenes on a lot of this kind of stuff. I know what goes on to put on a show, and everything at a church service, especially the kinds that I would go to, is designed for a specific effect. And at best, it's to facilitate a spiritual breakthrough or facilitate, God working in your life or whatever. At worst, it's showmanship. It's just performance. And that's fine. But I never really got into worship music much. I didn't enjoy it. It's all very like U2-ish and like just milk toast. I don't know. It's very formulaic, I guess is what I'm saying. Like there's a certain style of music that worship music is, and it's just like whatever. As far as the testimonies, yeah, they would bring people up who would claim like, oh, my back was healed and now I'm great. And again, I'm not trying to discredit people whose experience matches up with that.
Sure.
In fact, I find that really cool. Okay, great. I'm happy for you that you're not in pain anymore. But I was
If
born
it's
with
true, yeah.
Right. I was born with a seizure disorder that affected the motor skills on the left side of my body. So playing guitar for me is a huge triumph because I can't do the individual thing like I can with my right hand on my left. So for me to be able to play death metal is huge for me. But I prayed consistently, God, heal my left hand. Just please, I know you can. You did it, this and that. And then eventually I was just so resigned. I was like, well, I'll use it as oh, God healed these things in me, but he left this. And at this point, I don't really bother with it too much. I don't care. It is what it is. But yeah, they would bring people up, and especially during like conferences or after conferences where they would have these like healing times or events or whatever. I remember being at a conference, working on a conference, and they had this, I forget what they called it, but basically people made a tower, a tunnel, 2 people on each side, and they sort of grasped hands, to make a tunnel, and people would run through it. And the premise was you'd run through it and the Holy Spirit would come over you, and this would happen and that would happen. And it was just like, man, this is just
like a human doorway to blessing or something.
Yeah, I forget what it was like, but I was just watching it. I was just, man, why are people doing this?
Did you see Slaying in the Spirit at all?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, and in fact, I feel bad because I worked at a breakthrough event, is what they called it, as staff, and they volunteered me to come and catch people. Well, I had never caught another human being before in my life, and it was a woman. I really feel bad about this, and I hope she doesn't see this, but I really feel bad about this because she was slain in the spirit or whatever. They would put their hand on their head and sort of push them back, and I wasn't expecting full body weight, and she landed on my knee. I was like, oh, sorry. But yeah, I've seen that. I've seen people shout out of nowhere and start running around and wave banners and all this other stuff.
When you hear speaking in tongues, was that typically done, like I think it's a biblical concept that if there's someone doing it, there's an interpreter there, or did people just do like the glossolalia and just kind of no one was interpreting it, they're just kind of rambling?
Half and half. Generally though, I would say there's usually somebody nearby who could interpret it, and I was I was one of those people at certain points. It was fascinating. I don't necessarily think that it's the method that brings it out. There's sort of like an opening spiritually, I guess, that allows a sort of access to understand. Now, whether you can corroborate any of it is one thing,
Right.
but that's, I think one of the things that sort of tripped me up was how am I able to do this? Because I never really could speak in tongues, but I could listen. I could hear and tell people what they're saying or whatever. I assume they know what they're saying. I don't know. I'm assuming they know what they're saying. So maybe I'm like a second witness or something like that, I would assume. But yeah, I could interpret, couldn't speak it because I didn't think it was real. I didn't think that the logical mind of my brain it just couldn't accept the premise of speaking what is essentially gibberish or phonetics. And I'm not saying that to be disparaging, but what I'm saying is the majority of what I heard were not real languages. There were just syllables, like babbling syllables.
Right.
And ironically, or strangely enough, the majority of the people who could speak in tongues at this place or in different environments tend to use the same syllables, like of their environment.
Right.
So it's not really a language. And to say that everybody has a unique language is sort of a misnomer.
Yeah.
But yeah,
It's
generally,
learned.
yeah,
They're learning it from other people.
yeah, and to what degree people are sort of fudging it too is debatable.
Yeah.
But generally, like in prayer services or church services and stuff like that, there more often than not, if somebody were speaking in tongues, there would be somebody nearby who could understand what they're saying and say that too.
I'm curious, when you were in that, was it, I mean, this before you left, was it exciting? Was it scary? Was it freaking you out? Was it like, hey, I'm on the outside, but as I get closer to like the inner circle of this amazing dynamic and power, I'm just going to feel God's presence. This is just going to get more awesome. Or was it like, this is weird and I don't know, or like you know, like for me, when I watch Benny Hinn, for example, and I don't watch him much, obviously, but when I watch a 30-second clip, which is about as much as I can take, I'll watch him preaching, and I'm just like, I think if I was in the audience, like in his church, it would really like weird me out to see what this guy does.
Mm-hmm.
But then you think these people obviously come to church, they come over and over and over. So to them, they're not seeing it like they're weirded out. They're like, this is awesome. This is amazing. Like, I want to be here. I want to live in this environment.
Mm-hmm.
How did you see it when you were in the thick of it?
It was just the de facto experience.
Okay.
Because again, I had no frame of reference for denominations and what they do versus what another group would do. And prior to getting involved in this certain denomination, I just basically had a mainline experience. You'd go to a church and they'd have music going on. You'd sit down, you'd clap your hands, you do your thing. The church that I liked the most allowed me to be who I was. And at the time I was really confused and really scared. And they allowed me to just be in the church and go sit in the corner and cry audibly because that's what I needed to do. And then I moved on and ended up going to this church that I've been referencing this pretty much this whole time. And it was far bigger, but I felt compelled to be a certain way. Like I needed to conform with what was going on there in order to have that same acceptance or sense of community. And I didn't buy it. I didn't buy a lot of this stuff, especially once I started poking holes in their theology from the Bible, like using the Bible. Like, no, what they're saying is inaccurate. Their translation or what they're putting out is improper and inaccurate. And I don't stand for that, because you're trying to teach people, theoretically, trying to teach people how to live their lives better. Or maybe they're not, I don't know. But that's what I was saying earlier about the agendas. Like there's very much an agenda against human sexuality. There's an agenda against, or really actually there's an agenda for supporting your church, which I guess has its purpose. I guess if you're going to support a place, that's fine. But the sheer cost of the overhead being publicly funded from, something wrong about that.
And being tax exempt on top of it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So that was a big deal for me, was once I started seeing like, oh, what they're saying is not what the Bible's teaching about these matters. That's when I think my exit was beginning, because eventually I stopped going to church. I was so scared to do that. It's like, oh, well, don't forsake the gathering of the brethren, this and that. Oh, you need to go to church. God wants you to go to church. And I just stopped going one day. I was like, I'm going to not go today. And I waited. I was like, you going to hurt me? Okay, nothing's happening. So you don't care if I go to church? And then I sort of had maybe I should still go here and there. And then I did. And then eventually I was just like, nah, not for me. Could be the denomination and some of that, because again, too, you have to realize simultaneously I'm involved with this figure, this person that if I named, you would know who she is, especially if you're within that circle.
Sure.
So I'm getting it at work and having that environment at work, and then church is sort of an extension of that work. So I was never not around it necessarily, but I always kind of kept an outside looking in kind of feeling about it. It's like, I don't understand why this is important. I don't understand why people are not addressing these questions. I don't like, if you're new to something, you would want somebody to be available to at least validate your questions, if not be able to answer them.
Yeah.
And, I was doing some product development for this person using existing materials. So I was putting together, I was reading content from this book and that book and this book to put together a new book that they would eventually sell. And they did. And I just had questions because I was looking at it like, from a lay person's perspective, if you're just getting introduced to this content, why this, why that, how do you do this? Where is this coming from? Where do you get these theological underpinnings for the premises that you're offering people? And it just was never, ever addressed. I was like, well, this kind of really sucks, because here I am being coerced more or less to conform to what is there. And I'm totally ignoring and being ignored of the inquisitive side of my brain. And like, you'd think that, and frankly, I don't really remember if I got any answers in prayer necessarily, but you would think that if you're loved by God or whatever, that questioning is welcome. And to a degree it is, but so many people are afraid to question as much as they want to question, either for fear of being ostracized or losing God's favor or anything.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
When you were going through all these thoughts, did you have any either close friends or even romantic interests that were kind of keeping you in it longer than you otherwise would have been?
Well, my now ex-fiance was that person for me.
Okay.
Because, man, I just tried. I really tried. But I was having problems. Again, my deconversion didn't start with theological issues. It was the fact that I had been molded into somebody that I was never supposed to be. That I certainly wasn't expecting to turn into. I was just a facsimile of somebody. You had asked me, like, who I am earlier. I wish I knew. Like, I'm slowly returning to that, but I don't really think that it's necessarily a knowledge. Like, you can take a mental or physical inventory of your strengths or skills or talents, and that's cool.
Yeah.
But to know who you are deep down it's more of an emotional investment than an intellectual exercise. And having been so hurt over time, I've sort of cloistered myself from experimenting emotionally with different things. So I'm growing into that.
But your fiance was a believer in that. Was she in that church?
She wasn't at the church that I've been talking about.
Okay.
We met later. In fact, she was an answer to prayer. I was praying 6 years ago, something like that. And I heard, you're going to get a girlfriend soon. I was like, oh, really? Okay, cool. So, now I'm on the lookout. It's like, okay, so tell me. And, she's not here yet. She will be soon. She's Black, this and that and this and this. And then I waited like 4 years, and then she showed up. She wasn't in the States yet. She was coming soon. She was Black. I forget what other things I heard during that time, but she shows up, and we get acquainted and things like this. And I thought that I was going to marry her. I was aiming to marry her. In fact, I had given her a ring, and it just was not the thing. It either wasn't the thing for her or the time or both, but she jumped ship and just cut ties with me and her family and went off to Texas to this healing school, led by another charismatic figurehead that I'm sure you could probably piece together the information if you were to do just a modicum of research.
So she was deeply religious in the sense that she was stepping away from the romantic relationship to further her relationship with the Lord and with her ministry and so forth.
Yes. But to a detriment that I think she didn't recognize, or she was willing to take that chance. I'm not just talking about our relationship or the relationship with our family, but I mean, she took out her entire retirement to leave and go to this place and pay for it. And after going to a conference, and I went and visited her at this conference, which was in the Midwest, and I this other person was in the thing and noticed that I had just come in. And she's like, oh, what do you think? I was like, oh yeah, no, I used to do these kinds of things. I know how they're done. I know how they're done. I know how to put something like this on. And she's like, oh, okay. Like she didn't think it was, something ordained by God. She thought it was something ordained by God. And I told this lady, I was like, no, it's, you rent a building, you get some people, you fly them in, you put on a show, whatever. It was like a prophecy conference. And then she was just so like, oh, this is what I want to do. I got to be with people who are doing this. And so she left, and that tore me apart. I was like, here, you were like, I cried for you to be in my life, and you showed up, and I wasn't going to take that for granted. And now here I am having to adjust my plans because you decide, I want to go and do that.
That's a great point, because you're touching too on the idea of God's will. Like this is the idea that people can be convinced so clearly, and I've had this several times in my life before deconversion, where you know what God is doing, the doors he's opened, you pray for something and you see him answer it. And when he does answer it so crystal clearly, you're like, oh, this is exactly what I knew. God clearly, brought mentors and wise counsel and answers to prayer and things in the scripture that would stand out to you, like, this is God at work. And then it would fall apart and you'd be like, wait a second, was this God's will or wasn't it? And that itself is not a reason to deconvert, in my opinion, because it could just be a misunderstanding of God's will, but it does start the wheels turning of saying, maybe I'm missing something here. And it's good when people see that. I'm sure some people don't deconvert as a result of that experience, but because I didn't at first, for sure. And it was like a 1% of my deconversion for sure at best, but it's like seeds that planted to say something's wrong here. So the picture does not add up.
Yeah. And it's been a hard adjustment. I mean, it's gotten better over time. I'm not through the mud entirely as far as that part's concerned, but you have to realize too that around this time is also around the time where I really began debating whether this was profitable for me. And I don't mean that in a monetary sense, but what I mean is what benefit has holding this faith or being exposed to this faith had on my life? And I couldn't really justify it. Not to mention,
it felt real. Like, did it feel real to you though? Like, did you feel like you were actually talking to God?
Yeah, absolutely. And okay. I still have a desire to keep that kind of a communion with something.
Okay.
But at this point, I'm really heartbroken, I think, is a really good way of explaining it. And I
Sure.
don't want to involve myself in anything spiritual necessarily. I'm open to it, but like I'm very reticent. But around the time of this conference that she attended was around the same time that I began like really looking into this, because around Christmas time the year prior, I had asked myself, what do the Magi know? And you can talk about the wise men, but they weren't smart. I mean, they were, but excuse me, it's kind of a misnomer. They were astrologers. They were, they had this sort of esoteric information that the character of Daniel is also described to have been taught. And they came, to see the star, at least according to the story. And
Probably
so,
Zoroastrian astrologers at that
right.
too, right?
No, exactly. And that's where I was going to go with that, because I was just wrapping presents on my bed and I was just like, what did they know? Like, why would these three disparate people decide to come to see this thing? And then, then I started looking into Zoroastrianism. I was like, oh, fascinating. So you can thank them for this and that, and, this and that. While
Just,
also,
did it ever strike you, the whole part of the story about the star hovering over the house? Like, if a star got close enough to us to where you could distinguish it's over that house versus this one, we would be incinerated.
yeah, no kidding.
It's like, did it ever? I laugh at some of the stuff that it just doesn't hit you as a kid.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I don't necessarily think that I took a more scientific approach to that either. In understanding that, I was more looking at it from the standpoint of the story. Like,
Yeah.
why is this story important, and where does it come from, really?
Yeah.
Because I mean, I had heard about astrotheology and stuff like this before, and sort of looked into that, and I'd seen Zeitgeist. I didn't really, whatever. But all this to say, that one question, like, what do they know, prompted me into looking into Zoroastrianism, and then Platonism, Hellenism, all this other stuff, and how the book was formed. Because, I already knew about the Apocrypha. I already knew about these different testaments and gospel stories and legends and stuff like this. And
So you were really doing your homework on this.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, starting from looking into lust and tithing and stuff, which were typical shame-based points from the pulpit. I was looking at, I was like, no, there's no reason to be thinking this way, to be adopting this mindset, especially specifically about those topics. Then it grew into, like, I wanted to learn about church history, and then I went into the Aramaic New Testament, and for a little while I was like, oh, well, that's the, what do they call it, the Aramaic, not supremacy, but I forget the term, but there were some people who were talking about that, and how, if you read it in Aramaic, you would see it in a different light, and that may be true. And honestly, like, I don't possess a lot of tangible books at this point, which sucks, because I really need to get some more books, like actual physical books. But my digital library is insane. I have, pre-Nicene Bibles. I have, books about archaeology and traveling, nomadic people from the 1800s, and Jesus myth books and all this other, like, lots of stuff. And so people are like, oh, well, I wanted to learn about this. How do I find it? I'm like, try this PDF. Here, take this and see what you can learn from it. So when those things kind of converged, where I was like, oh, Zoroastrianism, and then I emailed Robert Price. I don't know if you know.
Oh yeah.
I emailed him, and I was just like, because I'd also begun listening to Seth Andrews and Robert Price and Richard Carrier, and I love Kenneth Humphreys. I love his sharpness, and
his humor is pretty amazing too.
Yeah, I was watching The Atheist Experience, just to introduce, like, some critical thinking into the theological premises of this faith, some of them. And I was just like, man, this makes a lot more sense than what I was given. And then eventually became like, well, why is it relevant? And around that time, to loop back around, was when my ex-fiance was like, oh, I want to go do this. I'm like, I don't know that I can tell you that I believe anymore. And she was like, that's okay. But it wasn't okay. And I told her, I read Nailed from David Fitzgerald
Yeah.
in my research. And I was just like, hey, I waited.
Give a shameless plug for it for anyone that's
Yeah.
doesn't know what book we're talking about, Nailed by David Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
Pick it up. It's a good one.
Oh yeah. It's an easy read too. It's not terribly academic in the sense, like it's not a textbook. It's a very easy read. I went away for a weekend just to get away and to read and to think. And I came back and I waited probably another week. I was like, listen, I don't believe this anymore. And I didn't want to. And I didn't want to not believe. I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Not only theologically, but also personally. Like I could not understand why, after adopting Christianity as a faith or religion or an outlook or whatever, my life went to crap. Like I stopped caring about what I cared about. I stopped paying attention to my own needs and who I was as a person. My prayer life, and this is pluses and minuses, but like my prayer life, if you want to, however you want to phrase that, became less about, remember the experiments I was talking about. I don't know if we mentioned this during the recording or prior. It became less about like seeing just how this works to praying for other people's help, their health, for other people, and like seeing results and seeing seeing the effect of what I was praying for happen for them, not for me, and all this stuff. So it just, after I told her, we went to this prayer group thing that she was involved with, this John G. Lake type healing room thing, but it was more of a prayer circle. And I went up there, I sent an email, and I was like, here's my issue. I don't know how to not do this anymore. And I don't want to be a part of this. And it was such like, why would you go there for something like that? But I had no other recourse. I didn't know what else to do. I figured they'd understand. So we're sitting there in this circle, and I was like, yeah, I don't believe this anymore. And I don't want to be a part of the church with the capital C. And
so you were sharing that right with your other Christian friends?
Oh, they weren't friends.
Okay.
I before I told anybody else in my life, like friend wise or even family, I don't even think I've really mentioned this much to family, a little bit to my dad. I went to this group, this sort of more of an objective kind of stranger. We don't know you, so we'll just pray for help that whatever. Because I was just like, I don't know what to do. And I don't want to be a part of this. And I love what I thought God should be or is, and I don't want to be this. And but frankly, that's a much more tame experience, because we went and sat with this guy in this thing. He took us in, and I had tried to tell a number of people, like, I just don't want to do this anymore. And instead of like, because I had to rehash this thing so many times with so many people, I exploded on him. I was like, I'm not going to swear because I don't know if your audience or YouTube will let you or whatever the case. I want my mind back. And I was red, like spittle and everything. And I was just like, I have never been this mad over anything in my life. And I was like, I want out. I don't want this anymore. I want my life back. I want my mind back. I want my identity back. I want my personhood back. And when we got into the group, after I calmed down, one dude, they were praying or whatever and asking for help. And this one guy out of nowhere was just like, have you accepted the Lord into your heart? And I was like, yeah, I've been baptized twice. I've taken communion a bunch of times. I have recommitted myself a handful of times because I never thought I was doing enough. Yeah, I did. All this other stuff. He was like, because this, the last thing you want to do is get hooked up into this new age stuff. I'm just like, this is not what I came here for. He's threatening, he's like, oh, if somebody were to come into here right now with a gun and shoot you, do you know where you would go? I'm like, no, and I don't care. So you don't care about going to hell? I was like, no, because I don't care. I have things to do now.
Mm.
And mid-60s guy, and I was just like, dude, this is inappropriate, entirely inappropriate. And I stormed out. I was like, I'm not listening to this, being threatened with hell because I don't want to believe in this. Imagine that. Like, I don't want to believe in this. I don't believe in this, and I don't want to be a part of it. Like, how are you gonna threaten somebody with punishment because you don't believe something?
Yeah.
It's really, really difficult premise. And then I say that because the other guy, the guy that I yelled at, said something like, to the effect of like, question, but don't throw Jesus out. I'm like,
Yeah.
well, that's a dumb premise, because how are you going to get to a truth of this matter if you don't examine even Jesus?
Yeah.
And I was like, so basically what you're saying is I can ask my questions. I can, play around with this little thing and have a good little time. Just make sure that you don't throw away the one thing that we think you need the most. It's not really about, they weren't trying to understand me. It was more like, oh, just make sure you're still tied in with Jesus, with God. I'm like, the whole reason I'm doing this is because I want to know.
Yeah.
I'm not doing this to piss off some people. I'm not doing this to arbitrarily be like, oh, well, I'm not a Christian now or whatever. It's like, you think that I wanted to do this? Like, that's a lot of the times when somebody who deconverts tries to tell somebody that they think cares about them, or whether it's family or friend that are supposed to love them, that like, I no longer believe in this religion or this faith, it's just, some of them will just completely write you off. It's like, well, I'm sorry, we can't be friends. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there's one of the things that I said not long ago was about this kind of a thing was, if your estimation of myself, of me, is determined by whether or not I believe these things or am a part of this faith or this club or this whatever, then you don't really care about me. You didn't really know me, because I am generally the same person I was when I started as when I am now. And I said, I wrote this out somewhere. I don't remember where. It's probably in this group that we're in months ago. I said, I didn't change. Like, there's nothing, well, some things have changed with me, but for the better. Yeah. In my own self-discovery and my own desire to like take care of myself is what has made me better, not the religion and not the faith, as much as I wanted it to. But I said, there's nothing about me that has changed. I just don't believe the same things. I'm still the same person. I will bend over backwards for you if you have a problem. If you need money, I'll give it if I have it. If I have extra clothes, I donate it. I spend time with my dad's pet because he doesn't do it. Like, I am that guy. I am the funny, charming, lovable person that you met. I'm just not a part of the faith anymore.
Yeah, you didn't need Jesus to be a good person, or to have a loving heart, or to have a passion for helping people. I've been smiling. I don't know if you've seen, but I've been smiling for the last 10, 15 minutes, because so much of what you're saying is resonating. And I got to step back too. I love how you said, when you were describing how you got a little bit more passionate about beginning to make it clear that you were moving on, where you said, I want my mind back. And yeah. I got to say, that encapsulates it, I think, for so many people. And they realize the brainwashing, they realize the blinders, they realize they weren't told so much, they realize they weren't doing what John Loftus would call an outsider test for faith, to say, this is really ridiculous. And I didn't realize how ridiculous it was. But now that I'm stepping back, I'm asking you all with me, to just have an honest conversation. Don't you see how ridiculous this is? I mean, just for example, just to give one simple one, like you're talking about a God who, number one, changes his name repeatedly, even though, in that culture, or in that time, it looks like he's trying to say, I want to distinguish myself as holy. I'm separate from everyone else. I'm not like these other gods. So I want to be really clear who I am. I'm different. Okay, well, you're different, but you're copying the names of all the other gods in the area. And then you're switching your name. And like, that doesn't make sense. And then like, okay, I'm this God that really, really, really wants to communicate and bless the world. But I'm going to do it for a while by simply wiping out entire tribes and other people that aren't, with my group. And it's like, okay, it could be right. Yeah, granted, if we grew up in it, especially, it still sounds right to us. It could be right. And certainly if there is a God, he has the right to do what he wants. He's the king, granted. But from an outsider's perspective, which is what you have to say, I'm still in the inner circle of Christianity. But from an outsider's perspective, what would they say? And they would say stuff like, this kind of sounds man-made. So if you step back and you say, I want to examine that. Does this sound man-made or doesn't it? And even literally man-made with the misogyny, where women are mistreated so badly. Does this sound man-made or does this sound divine? And it is amazing to me, I think you're alluding to this, like the Christians, they cannot seem to put their minds around it. And I don't want to do this whole us versus them thing either. I know your passion is to be divisive, right. But when you step out, you realize there is a division that's naturally there that says, I have chosen, for whatever reason, maybe it's my personality, maybe it's my experiences, but I've chosen to do an outsider test for faith and to be honest with myself to say, this doesn't sound right. Genocide that includes, stealing people's land, kidnapping young girls, this doesn't sound right to me. And, we could add on to that for hours, but so many things that don't sound right. And then, the canonicity, why do they pick this book versus that book? Why does this copy Greek epic stuff? Well, why is this so heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism? Why is the canon quoting from, the book of Enoch dozens and dozens and dozens of times, but yet we don't include Enoch? All this stuff. And it's like, it could still be right. I could just be misunderstanding it. And part of it is, yes, I just need to learn more. But as you learn more, what I found is things don't get better, they unravel. You're pulling the sweater, the string from the sweater out, and eventually you're left with nothing. And what's so crazy to me is that when you, and I'm going to ask you too if you've had this experience, when you finally get out and you say, hey, I've got some new information that we all haven't been talking about, but I'm now on a different side of the fence because of this set of content, this information. And, other people know that. They know that you're dealing with a different set of perspectives, a different set of information. And instead of them saying, hey, Anthony, you're obviously a good guy with a heart of gold, but you switched, tracks. What was it that you learned? What was it that made you think through this and go a different path? They don't, in my experience, typically ask that. They just say, we're praying for you. You need to repent and get back to Jesus. And the whole idea of maybe they're wrong. Maybe they're not they'll be like, oh, Anthony left, but it's because one of us didn't present the gospel right, or we twisted it, or he twisted it in his head. And it's always like, we just didn't present it right, or he didn't understand it right. And if in an ideal sense, Anthony could just get the gospel clearly in his head without any of the distractions of human, bad interpretations, whatever, just him and God and the gospel, it would be crystal clear. But the idea of, no, the gospel is man-made, and it is fabricated in large part as a copy of other Greco-Roman mystery cults, heavily influenced by blood magic, human sacrifice, which goes way before Christianity and Judaism. All this stuff, and like they can't. It's like you're talking a different language.
Yeah, no, because it will always default to, no, that's wrong. This came from God, and so, archaeology doesn't matter. Other societies and cultures don't matter, because they don't. I mean, Christianity has a notorious history of completely not only exploiting other cultures, but then completely demolishing them to the point where we have no trace of some civilizations and their spiritual practices, if nothing else.
Yeah, that's a good point.
so it becomes like, and this was a huge thing in the church that I've been talking about, where it's like, even to the denominational preference, I guess, but like anything outside the Bible is inherently wrong or misinformed or bad for you or has some sort of spirit attached to it that you got to avoid. And it's just like, look, if you want to have faith, go ahead. But I would rather have a sort of, does it make sense to have this faith? Does it make sense to believe any of this stuff? Does it make sense to practice any of these things? Because I was going to say practice what you preach, but what's being preached and what's being practiced sometimes are synonymous, but are not always positive.
Yeah.
And so, and that's another thing I was going to mention while you were speaking. Something came to me about one of the problems that I had with belonging to the church that I was involved with, that sort of de facto church, was, and maybe not so much with the one where I was baptized, but because that was a different thing. But the one I've been speaking about the most is that I found myself sort of testing the waters about these sort of invisible or implied agendas, namely about demonizing others. Like there's very much like an us versus them kind of thing built into the faith, but especially with the charismatic and Pentecostal thing, I've noticed. But with specific regard to homosexuals and LGBTQ communities, and also
They're strongly
sort of like,
opposed to them, you're saying?
yeah. And I'm like, well, why? I looked into that too, and a lot of what's been coined as homosexuality since I think the 1960s. I could be wrong about the date, but I believe the 1960s was when homosexuality entered into the translation of the Bible. It could be earlier than that, but not much more. Prior to that, a lot of the terms which are coined to be homosexual or whatever the case deal with pederasty. And I think in most circumstances, I think a lot of people can probably get behind not being okay with that. But it's all been lumped together or completely overshadowed by terminology. And that's a big thing for me. Lingo and stuff like that. I really like using plain language, even if I have maybe I don't want to say a stronger vocabulary, but I do tend to be a little bit more verbose or wordy about how I articulate things. But lingo is a problem for me. If I have to figure out what you're saying, and then the meaning for it to be able to use that language, there's something inherently wrong, misleading by using that. But these hidden agendas, I found myself at war against these things. Like, I don't have a problem with gay people at all. I'm not gay. I don't have to, it's not a concern for me. But for them to, for the church, the whole establishment, to be so adamantly against people they don't even know for behavior that is inconsequential to their own lives is really fascinating to me. And the same thing with sort of like political leanings. I found the church that I was in sort of leaning to the right, and that's fine. I mean, everybody has their own things. I don't really know where I stand with that either right now, but I found myself like kind of having to go along with it rather than actually agreeing with it.
Yeah.
And I don't believe in conforming for, the sake of a social group. It just doesn't seem strong to me.
And they're doing it based on the Bible, which is, again, if you're going to take such a strong stance against people where you're literally ostracizing them, you better be sure that you're right. And you're talking about people basing it on interpretations of a Bronze Iron Age book, I guess you'd say, that we're not even sure who wrote a lot of these books.
Yeah.
The Christians want to say, oh, tradition says this, tradition says that. We're not sure who wrote a lot of these books. We're not sure how they've been changed and edited, interpolated. We're not sure that we have the right copies. And that goes on across the board for every book of the Bible. But then it's like we're not sure about almost any of the ways that they picked which books should even be in this. Like there might be other books that said different stories. I mean, there's other books that talk about Jesus as a child.
Yeah.
There's books that talk about in the book of Enoch that I'm studying, with some of these the Son of Man focus, and then the Ascension of Isaiah with the visions and the cosmology. There was all kinds of other ideas that were going on, and other perspectives, and some council, usually I believe men, some council of men somewhere said, we are going to be the redactors and the editors and the gatekeepers for this information. And if it doesn't fall into our approval, we are basically going to put it, in the fire. And
yeah,
so it's
and that's really what it was too. That's not a metaphor.
Yeah,
you really did burn a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and it's like now you're going to take the end result of multiple versions of that, where a group of men here did that, and another group of men here did that. They kept on making changes and making approvals, disapprovals, and you're going to take your interpretation of a translation of a book that was heavily redacted, heavily edited, heavily plagiarized, even you could say, but from other religions, and that's going to be your moral standard.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it goes back to what we all say as atheists. If you're going to make extraordinary claims, you better have extraordinary evidence. And the evidence is horrible for the Bible. The Bible has nothing about it that looks divine. It looks incredibly man-made and poorly man-made at that.
Yeah. I've graduated away from that sort of historical mosaic, because I was into doing that as well. That's why when you posted the video about Jacob Berman, I'd seen him on Myth Vision a handful of times, and some of what he was talking about really resonated with where I was at the time, especially about researching Yahweh, and it was a tribal god, and sure enough, just pretty much like Constantine in Christianity, it was God by the tip of the sword. And it's fascinating to me because when you take more of an archaeological standpoint and see how this sort of developed, it changes the way that you can view how this transpired. And I sort of hold the position, either people made it up and used it to their advantage, which is a possibility, or I don't want to use a false dichotomy necessarily, but or there's the potential of there having been some kind of a divine contact, and this is the thing, and then it changes over time with people trying to understand what the message is. I do find it fascinating, though, that a lot of the Abrahamic faiths, if not all of them, start with some person having some radical spiritual experience away from everybody else, and then coming back, with the news and hey, this is from God. This is what God says. But taking a more evidentiary approach to it and be like, okay, because I got into DM Murdoch and I started reading the Christ Conspiracy, I think is what it was. And I didn't get that far into it because I have a tendency to start books and then put them down, or I'll start them and then my focus will change onto a different topic and I'll go into that. But man, just the atrocities that these believers committed against women and children and men and indigenous peoples and stuff like this in the name of whatever this is. That's where, I mean, that's obviously patently wrong, but or abhorrent, but that's where I wonder how much of it, that's where that dichotomy of well, it was either, it could be inspired, it could be man-made, but regardless, it's turned into a construct and a power, like a control mechanism.
Yeah.
And then you can get into the Jesuits having a hand into preterism and futurism and how that affects, and neither of them is really true. And how that, some people think, prophecies are supposed to happen in the future. And then other people think that they stopped when the temple was destroyed, this and this. And it's just like, man, if you take away the divinity aspect of it and you just take a look at, here's how do I explain it? without getting into like mind control stuff. Here's a piece of information that we're going to feed you. This is truth. We're going to take a piece of information, we're going to feed it to these people. This is truth, and they don't know what they're talking about. We're going to feed another piece of information to the third group, fourth group, whatever. They don't know what they're talking about. Or maybe there's some commonalities and you can all find harmony. But to see the hand of man on this thing in an attempt to just crush humanity, to put it really bluntly, is fascinating. It's despicable to me. It's despicable and intriguing because just like, say, MK Ultra Mind Control, how does this work? It's trauma bonding, but how do you do it? There's psychological warfare, but then there's a physical component which can escalate the trauma bonding. So what would that be from something that is largely psychological? There's typically a physical component to trauma bonding with MK Ultra Mind Control. So how do you accomplish that with a psychological warfare? Because prior to the demonization of other people has become less violent physically over the history of Christianity, but it's become more and more blatantly corrosive mentally and spiritually and emotionally. That really, I forget the study. I should go through my timeline because I posted a link to a study that claims that the more religiously fundamentalist you are, the more your decision-making capability erodes. It completely shuts down. So I just wonder how that's accomplished, because at the beginning of the Constantine era Christianity, when it became less about a menacing cult, whatever, we didn't need to deal with them, when it became a means for controlling the public, they did it the same way that the Yahweh cult did it, by brute force and torture and all this other stuff. So while I guess Christians can claim that they're not necessarily peaceful, or I'm sorry, not necessarily violent, I don't think they would go so far as to be entire pacifists, but the damage is done verbally. It's done through action. It's and thoughts and it's being taught, because when
it's
you're
very subversive, it's very psychologically deep. It makes you really it's and you can get out of it, and you can still feel its tentacles in you.
Oh, I still do. I'm not far off from being out of it at this point. Like, there are still things that really affect me. There are still words that will pop up that I just cannot, it just because it's all just, you don't want to, it's problem reaction solution, where it's like, you have sin or you've sinned, God forbid. We have the answer. You perform in a way that's acceptable to the answer, and therefore it takes care of the problem. But it's like I said before, it doesn't change anything.
Yeah. Could I ask for kind of to get to the grand finale of the story?
Yeah.
Where are you with things now? Like, was there a watershed point where you just said, I know you expressed you feel like you want your mind back, I'm out. But was that it? Like, were you out at that point, or was there a period later where you made a final decision? And where are you with it now?
Oh man, I tiptoe through it. I sort of tip my toes into, theories and presentations and stuff like that. But largely, I just don't really want anything to do with it. I certainly don't want to be proselytized. You've got to come back. You've got to change your mind. You've got to, repent, whatever the case is, or try to tell me that I'm wrong. I very well could be wrong. I'm fine with that. The guy who was threatening me with hell for, God forbid, just wanting to stop doing this. If there is an afterlife, and if I am destined to hell, then I will accept that. That's a much more mature and reasonable thing than to like constantly live in fear about whether or not, it's like, look, if God is there and if God has the power, because then you get into Calvinism and stuff, either you've been predestined to burn in hell or you haven't. But if God is there, and if that's the end game, you're either going to go to heaven or hell, then that's not really, I mean, I guess it's my choice to a degree, but it's really, that's the verdict. It's like, oh, you're going there. Okay, well, I tried. And
So would you call yourself in any way still, I mean, we're all still searching,
yeah,
obviously, on a lot of levels, but would you say you were actually deconverted, or would you say you're still on the fence in any way on anything?
no, I'm not on the, I'm only on the fence in the sense that I could be wrong, but I'm willing to take that chance. I don't know why I've been watching this lately. Truth Surge is a YouTube personality, very fringe
Yes.
sort of YouTube personality, has some really cool presentations. And I was watching the uh, Hebrew Messiah or mythology. I forget what the title
Those are
is.
awesome. Yeah.
And I was like, man, but I still keep coming back. Like, why is this relevant? If I don't believe, and this has no bearing on me, why am I still curious? So yeah, I still have my moments, but largely I find myself in a position where I'm open to other things. I'm not really interested in exploring Christianity much anymore. I think that I've done, even though I didn't really cover it very well in our talk, I think I've done enough research in the ways that I needed to do it to where I don't have to believe this anymore. And I'm slowly becoming accustomed to being okay with that. I haven't made it public, which is ironic considering what we're doing, but I haven't made it largely public. But I just don't, I don't care to worry about it anymore, I guess. And should a time come where I am, wanting to go back, or there's some reason to go back, I guess I would. But even in the last sort of prayers I prayed, before the catalytic moment of like, I don't believe, I prayed, I said, God, I'll do this if you want me to do this. I just don't believe it. I don't believe it anymore. So
Do you think there is a God?
I don't know.
Do you,
I would love for that to be the case.
do you feel like you're open to the God of the Bible being the God, or is it like, no, if there's a
no.
God, it's not that one. It's
Yeah, I'm pretty hard line that if there is a God, it can't be like the one described in the Bible,
yeah,
and or championed from the church. And even if that were the case, I wouldn't pledge allegiance to it.
right.
Like I am no. I'm sorry that you exist. If that kind of a God exists, I'm sorry that that's the case. I don't value you. Like if I'm going to be speaking to it as a thing, like I don't appreciate the depiction of your character in the Bible. I don't appreciate the good works you've done through the Old Testament and New Testament. And frankly, if you were anything like that, even a fraction of what's described, I can't be your friend. I won't listen to you. I'm not going to be your partner. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm committed. I'm committed to not entertaining the God of the Bible.
Yeah, that's awesome.
If something would come and be like, oh no, that's wrong, and this is how I really am, great. Then I'd be happy to look into that. I just think that the way that the God of the Bible and even Jesus is depicted by the church, especially, and even by the book, is so human, like you were talking about. I just think that God's capacity, if there is one, God's capacity to understand individual human beings and what their needs are and where they are, especially with this, is far greater than church doctrine and their attitudes toward it, because they largely, especially the more fundamentalist you get, cannot accept that someone does not, or chooses not to believe this. It's like, how do you make that choice? Like, it's almost like it's not a choice. It's almost like a birthright or like an inheritance. It's like, well, why would you throw that away? It's like, well, I didn't want it. And once I saw what it was,
Yeah.
I don't want it. So
It's like Wizard of Oz. You pull back the curtain and see what's really there.
yeah.
I just want to say a couple of things, and then I want to have you have the kind of the last word with a question I wanted to ask. I first just want to say thank you for your willingness to share your story. I know we've probably only touched the surface on some of the topics. We've touched a lot, but some of them we could probably go a lot deeper on. And also, thank you for your insights. I'm the kind of person, I said before before we hit the record button, I take a lot of notes, and I'm almost like, I'm obviously not going to take notes while we're talking, but I'm almost like frustrated because I want to take notes because some of the stuff you're saying, I'm like, you brought up so many good points and ideas, and even just quotes. I want to use some of the thoughts you've got, and obviously I can go back to the video and do that later. But you're bringing insights that I think people either have thought of, but you're articulating them very clearly, or there's other thoughts that people just haven't brought to the table. And I encourage you to keep bringing your thoughts up, keep plugging in with whatever platforms you feel comfortable with to bring these insights, because people need the skepticism, they need the questioning, they need people that say there's more to this story, both in terms of the facts of Christianity's origins and just the philosophical and psychological aspects of this. I mean, honestly, there's a lot of people that they cannot see the psychopathic nature of God, the God character. Like, I don't want to say God as if this is real, because he's not, but just the character that's portrayed as a God in the Bible, it's a psychopathic character, and very, very, very horrific. And like you said, why would you want to bow your knee to the God like that? But I commend you for your insights.
Thanks.
I'm sad about some of the painful things that have happened as a result of all these things, and I certainly hope for tremendous healing and just beautiful things from this point. Just looking here at my notes, but again, thank you for your bravery and sharing the story. What I wanted to ask for, if you could, just to close this out, if you're someone who's been in some of the shoes that you talked about, but it's maybe 20 steps back, they've just read, they stumbled on a Seth Andrews video, they stumbled on a Richard Carrier video, they stumbled even just on a Hitchens clip, for 2 minutes of some quote, something, and they're like, you know what, I've got some digging to do. What would you say to that person on two levels, in terms of encouraging them in their journey and just pure encouragement, but then also direction? Like, where would you encourage them to start researching and studying to, as they're willing to, as much as they're willing to?
The second part of that question is a little tougher, because I guess that would be a more individual pursuit. Like, I'm sure there are an infinite number of reasons for somebody wanting to do this kind of an investigation. So I guess I would lead off from your best foot on that. Like, I guess start with things that are of interest to you. So if you have sort of theological sticking points or conceptual sticking points, let's say, from what's been brought out through your church or community, I would probably investigate that. Like, for me, I started with the Bible. Like, I started looking at these topics through the Bible, like reading the Bible. If that's your focal point, or your some of them, that's the standard for morality and stuff. So I would figure, if that's your standard for morality, you would really want to read what the book has to say on these different things, whatever they would be. So yeah, I guess start with your interest, because generally, if you're interested in a topic, you'll likely want to investigate further. Also, as much as it has been maligned or has been overshadowed by the idea of like listening to the Holy Spirit or whatever, use your intuition about what you're reading. And so, like, if you think something, like, as you're reading it, if it's not really lining up with what you think is probably accurate, jettison that stuff, just so that it's not a constant jagger in your thoughts. Like, oh, well, I'm going down this track, but this person has this line of thinking. You can see where they converge and diverge, but ultimately, just kind of take a mental inventory about what you're investigating and whether or not you really can see its validity. Because there are some conspiracy theories out there about how this was designed, and how it was packaged and put together and stuff like that. And you kind of have to triage your sources, and that's kind of what I did. I'd read D.M. Murdoch, I'd read Robert Price, I'd read David Fitzgerald, and other people too, and even Aaron Ra on different things, and look at the commonalities of the different trains of thought and see, okay, well, there's a through line here or a common thread with these things, but maybe not with this, maybe not with that. Like the Joseph Atwill sort of Caesar's Messiah type thing. There's some validity to it and some not. Other than that, and this also depends on where a person is in their investigation, but okay, the more you know, the less you know, or the more you know, the less you think you knew. So don't be afraid of that. Yeah. Not to use, to use the Bible as a point of comparison. There's, I think, a proverb, or maybe it's in Lamentations or something, where it basically distilled, it talks about, like, the more you know, the sadder you become, or like the more you realize, like.
Sounds like Ecclesiastes, but yeah, I'm not sure where it is either.
Yeah. You get my point.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid of what you read, and don't be afraid also of the people who would attempt to denigrate you or attempt to marginalize not only what you're doing, but your experience. Like, it's hard to find a community or a trustworthy companion to help you through this. Ironically, mine has been a chaplain of all people, who was like, yeah, you need to look into this and forget about what people are telling you. So I would urge people, if they're doing individual study or individual research, to attempt to make contact with trustworthy people as time goes on, to bounce ideas off of, and just to have a sort of support. And because it can be very isolating. It can be very isolating, especially if you come from a community of believers or a family of believers, or people who just generally are not aligned with the kinds of things that you're doing. What else can I offer?
Could I add one that I would just recommend? It's been a big benefit to me, is the Myth Vision YouTube channel. Derek Lambert's group, and there's others that are doing a very similar job, but I think Derek has become a bit of a spoke for the wheel of mythicism, and can't say enough good about him and his channel and his work. So and that would also spin you off into some other good sources. Like, if you're really looking to study the minimalist perspective on, maybe the Old Testament was written much later than we thought. You want to get into Russell Gomirkin, and that he's got it. The Berosus. If you're looking to get more into the pure mythicism stuff, he's obviously got a lot of Dr. Price and a lot of other people. Endlessly people that you could say, all right, I want to use Myth Vision just to find the people, and then I'll go and watch more of their videos on the side. But what would you say to people, just in an emotional, psychological sense? They're like, I'm struggling. I know that some people, this leads to atheism, or this leads to at least an agnosticism. I know that if I do that, I lose friendships, I lose relationships. I certainly lose the psychological comfort of heaven and glory, and if I'm praying to someone who's listening actively and who loves me and watches me and is superintending my life and putting a hedge of protection around me, that's suddenly, if I admit this isn't real, then that's psychologically a safety net that's gone. They're struggling with that. What would you say to them emotionally, just to say, don't be afraid, so to speak?
I love you, and it's going to be okay. At some point, it will stop being a problem. At some point, it will stop hurting so much, and eventually you can walk out of this in a new place. And if your investigation leads you back to your source, like back to your original position, fair enough. If it changes your mind, be happy for that. Be happy that you still have mental faculties available to you that you can use for your benefit to do something bigger than what maybe your church's outlook may have had for you. But it's going to be okay, and you can do it. It's it depends on where you want to go with it, but it can be very taxing emotionally. Just go. You kind of have to go with that. It's like a breakup in many ways, because God was personified, and especially through the character of Jesus, it's very like you have a focal point for, I'm going to lay your cares on God, and I'm going to pray, and I'm praying to this thing, I'm praying to this person. So it's like a breakup, and you have to go through that. If that's where you're going to go with that, like you'll have to go through that where you feel like you've lost somebody you care about.
Yeah. It's like a death. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. The irony of something like that, though, is when you step back from the dynamic of a relationship for a believer to its creator or whatever, you really eventually will see that it's been a lot on your end to foster it. It's been a lot, like you put in all this effort, devotion, care, agreement, behavior modification, all this stuff to appease this God, and God's going to do whatever God's going to do. So you have to look at that too. Like, how have I been mistreated in the ways that relationships and even emotions are displayed and characterized by this environment? So I guess just be prepared emotionally. Like, I have your back. I'm not invested in whether you find any new source of inspiration or change your mind or don't. But as somebody who is processing through stuff and has gone through even more stuff in a short amount of time, like a year and a half, there are people who care. There are people who are trained to deal with this stuff too. Like, I would recommend maybe getting a therapist if you can find one. It's one of the biggest. Yeah. Make sure it's a secular therapist. That's one of the things too that the medical community has not really glommed onto quite as heavily as I think they should, is religious indoctrination and religious trauma. Marlene Weinell has Leaving the Fold, and Valerie Tirico is another proponent for religious trauma syndrome. Seth Andrews has at least an interview with Marlene Weinell, if not both of them.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good reminders. That's some good stuff there that can help people to unwind the process.
Yeah. So I would look, if you can, I would look for resources that allow you to get a medically trained or like clinically trained perspective to help you process through some of these things. Because don't do what I did and go to a prayer group because you didn't know what else to do, because they're not going to hear you. They're going to hear what you're struggling with, but they'll likely think that it's your fault. Maybe it is, whatever. But don't go to a prayer group. If you need support, I would recommend maybe BetterHelp. If you have to pay for that, it's a benefit through my employer currently, so I'm taking advantage of that. Facebook groups, online communities of people that like xchristian.net, I think is a good forum for people who have kind of gone through and come out and can sort of nurture somebody who's in that phase where it's like, I don't know what to do about this. I see there's an issue, but I can't speak about it. I can't tell my pastor. I can't tell my, group leader or whatever the case is. So find resources. Yeah. Find resources, a safe place, a trained opinion, especially somebody who can work with like trauma, grief, abuse, narcissism. A lot of those components are really present in vehement Christianity for sure, and probably under the surface anyway. So don't be afraid, be prepared. I care about you. I do. I don't know you, but I care about you and whether you're healthy and whether you're helped. If you want to believe, but as long as you're strong as a person, that's something that is very quickly undercut in a lot of church circles. So I want to make sure that you're happy more than whether you change your belief system or whatever. And then just find resources.
I love those are awesome thoughts to end on, and it really is, you're touching on an issue that is very real for a lot of people, is that once you make a claim of I don't believe anymore, you may find a few people that are exceptions where they just love you to death anyway. I've heard of stories like that. So I'll admit that there are some people that have that experience, but a lot of people, myself included, the minute that you stake your claim, you are not worth anything. Your
Yeah.
value is gone, and they pretty much want you gone. Like, pretty much it's like when you get walked out of a job. Not that I ever have, but you know that you've seen that before. Where someone, some companies just there because of the security or whatever. They're like, if someone gets fired, they don't give it like a 2 week, hey, in 2 weeks you're going to end your job. Like the security guard comes to your
Yeah.
desk, walks you out, and they'll mail you your stuff or something. It's like that. Like once you take your claim, you're out, and you're out permanently. And obviously they'd pray for your repentance, and they'd let you back in if you agree with their theology again. But it's a very lonely road. It's a very hard road, and you need the kind of support that Anthony's talking about, because it's like this is a whole, it's like you're starting over. It's like, I love that Matrix perspective of when Neo is just escaped, and Morpheus is working on him, and Neo's like, why do my eyes hurt? And he's like, you've never used them before.
Yeah.
You are using your eyes for the first time in so many ways, and you need people that can help you walk, take the first steps. And so the stuff you mentioned it's awesome advice. So thank you for going through that.
Oh yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you again, Anthony, for this. Has been great. We went a lot longer than I thought we would. This is awesome. I feel like we could go on for another 2 hours, but maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Yeah.
Go into some deeper subtopics here. But I appreciate your bravery, your willingness to share, and I know you share in other venues. So thank you. Please keep doing it, and please keep making your voice stronger in all this. And I look forward to the next time.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Tim. I appreciate it.
Thank you.